So, is there going to be a twist at the end of this review? Well, you'll just have to wait and find out. Hey, don't you dare click ahead. Bad. Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well, and welcome to my review of the season or series premiere, depending on how you look at it, in multiple different ways, considering both a series is what they call seasons in the UK, as well as the fact that we're also on season 1 of Doctor Who now. Regardless, we're talking about the first 2 episodes of the latest season of Doctor Who, season 1, technically, titled Space Babies and the Devil's Chord, the introductory season of Ncuti Gatwa as the Doctor, though technically not his first appearance as the Doctor, because he also appeared in the Church in Ruby Road, as well as the Giggle. You know what? It's very confusing, timey-wimey, whatever. We're talking about these 2 episodes. Just deal with it. We're not going to get into the whole marketing nonsense with Disney and BBC and Doctor Who and all of that stuff, Bad Wolf Productions. Let's just talk about these 2 episodes. I have been so freaking pumped to watch this season for numerous different reasons going into it. As many of you know, if you saw my review of The Church on Ruby Road, I have really adored Ncuti Gatwa and the little bits and pieces that we've got of him so far. He has been just a bundle of amazing energy that I think perfectly captures what I love about the Doctor. So just seeing that in The Church on Ruby Road, I was just excited to see him in a more episodic format rather than in like the big specials that he's appeared in so far, and just see what he gets to feel like just getting to exist in a normal quote-unquote Doctor Who experience. And I really think that these 2 episodes just I think are really interesting starters for this season and era of Doctor Who. Now, before we get into it, I will say I'm going to talk full spoilers about the episodes. I'll try and stay spoiler free for the most part at the beginning, and then get into larger spoilers as we go through. The spoils of war. Anyways, I'm sorry, I'm in a mood. It's late at night. I've had a couple beers while watching Doctor Who. You're just gonna have to deal with my energy right now. Anywho, I will get into full spoilers in just a few minutes, but I'm not gonna give like a clear delineation, between the 2. So just be prepared for that. Now, let's talk about the fact that we get these 2 episodes at once. Now, setting aside my fact that I'm constantly annoyed at Disney Plus premiering multiple episodes at a time. I'd rather just have, 1 episode at a time and get it week to week. I think that's more fun, especially for a very episodic show like Doctor Who. But I think there's an interesting reasoning behind them having released these 2 episodes at once, because they kind of do interestingly opposing and different things that I think were kind of interesting setups for the rest of the season going forward for both new and old Doctor Who fans. Because Space Babies, the first of these 2 episodes, very much feels like it's trying to be a reintroduction to Doctor Who for, fans that may be jumping into Doctor Who right here, maybe watch The Church on Ruby Road or some of the specials, but don't know all the ins and outs of Doctor Who. And I actually watched this episode with my partner, who has seen some of the older quote-unquote stuff. When I say older stuff, I mean Christopher Eccleston and David Tennant stuff, so older. By the way, Ruby saying she was born in 2004 hurt me. It hurt me on a deep level. That's beside the point. That happened later on in this episode. But yeah, she's seen some of those, but she hasn't watched all of Doctor Who, at least in the modern context, so she's missed some of the stuff. It was actually kind of funny for me where the Doctor was explaining, it's like, yes, I'm the last of the Time Lords. It's like, oh, that never really got resolved from Christopher Eccleston's era. I'm like, no, it did. But then it kind of looped back around. There was some stuff with Jodie. It was wild. So it's just kind of an interesting re-onboarding to who the Doctor is with this episode. I really do like that they are bringing in the Impossible Child storyline in an emotional way that centers on the Doctor's character. It's not dealing with all the mythos of the Timeless Child. I meant to say that, the Impossible Child, the Timeless Child, where he technically they were from another universe. It gets mentioned in all of those things, and maybe even will tie into some larger mythology stuff that we got hinted at in episode 2, but really it's honed in on the the emotion that the Doctor feels as an orphan, and I think that emotional weight that we get in this premiere episode with Space Babies, I think is really, really good. So we get a lot of like the explanation of how the Doctor Who stuff works, like how they're able to read English. Ruby sort of asks a lot of those questions. So I think that is a lot of what Space Babies was, and it was also kind of a very similar, story that we see for most second stories with a new companion or a new Doctor, which is like go to the far-flung future and just have like a really quick sort of storyline adventure that introduces us to the character and kind of the concept of Doctor Who. And I think Space Babies does that really, really well. Whereas the Devil's Chord is kind of setting up the Doctor Who mythology on a completely different course, because in this episode, and I'll talk specifics more in a minute when we get there, but this episode is very much trying to build off of some of the stuff that we saw with the Giggle specifically, and really set up a new kind of tone, and I almost want to say rules for Doctor Who that feel much more in line with magical realism than with science fiction. And Doctor Who has always kind of skirted the line of science fiction to magical realism to a degree, but now we are fully in on the magical realism elements that this episode brings in, and I want to say I am fully on board. I really am enjoying it. I have some caveats about how it's handled, but it does definitely feel like episode 2 of this two-parter, I guess we'll call it, 2 episodes, is trying to set up those rules and establish like we are in a kind of magical realism mode for the Doctor and Doctor Who going forward after the events of the Giggle and some of the stuff that we saw with Church on Ruby Road with the goblins in that episode. So really, these two just are kind of like, here's what Doctor Who is, here's what Doctor Who is now. And I think that that's a really interesting kind of back-to-back episodes that you could do here to both bring in new fans and excite older fans of Doctor Who, and really kind of set the tone in a very fascinating way. Like, we know what the identity of Doctor Who is, but we can play within that sense of play, what the new rules are, the state of play is, whatever. Sorry, again, couple beers in me. So I really did adore this kind of back-to-back episode format because I think they play off of each other rather well. Let's talk a little bit more about specifics, starting with Space Babies. Like I said, Space Babies feels like a more traditional Doctor Who adventure. We have a monster, we have, the Doctor and Ruby discovering the new, the world that they are in and just, uncovering what the rules are and how things are set up. It feels very standard. It reminds me a lot of, episodes from, Russell T Davies' early era as well. Blanking on episode titles at the moment, but just a lot of those, science fiction episodes where it's just they appear and now they need to just learn the rules of what's going on and then they're able to solve the mystery. So Space Babies isn't very elaborate, isn't very complex, and yet it has just enough weirdness to it that I had a lot of fun with it. Seeing the little space babies literally just talking and just being, frozen in growing up, which was sort of an interesting, they had some science fiction-y explanation for that with there was this ray that was preventing them from growing up. I thought that was a lot of fun. I will say the babies' mouths, the CGI on the babies' mouths weirded me out every time I saw them. It was very strange. But I really loved the writing of the babies. They were so adorable, and I love animals. I find animals very adorable and baby animals very adorable. For some reason, human babies I never found them super cute. I've never been oh, look at the tiny baby. I think they're fart machines. I don't know. But the way these babies were written of just wanting a hug and it's oh, mommy and daddy here. Do you love me? I love you, Ruby. That was very, very adorable. And was portrayed rather well. And I love, again, that we get the Doctor able to open up a little bit about who he is at this point in time, coming off of the Timeless Child stuff. And I thought that was a good way to handle that. And the other thing that I liked about this episode, too, was it giving characterization to both the Doctor and to Ruby. Ruby especially. My big problem with the Church on Ruby Road is that Ruby didn't feel like a fully fleshed out character at that point. She had a lot of, elements of her backstory explained to us, about, the fact that she was, abandoned as a child, that sort of stuff. We'll get to that element in a little bit. We'll get to the mystery box of Ruby in just a moment. But she had a lot of like, a backstory, but not a ton of characterization beyond like, ooh, what's happening? This is a lot of crazy stuff going on. She didn't have a lot of opinions on things beyond just being startled or fascinated. And here we get a little bit more of her because there's that moment when they're going after the bogeyman, and the doctor says, "Go up, get out of here," and she's like, "Nah, I'm coming with you. I want to explore with you. Like, you're not going off on your own." Like those are moments of characterization that I needed for her. And then we also, Ncuti Gatwa just brings this energy of like, yeah, I'm so curious and excited to discover new things. And I think it was very wonderful to see like him being afraid of the bogeyman and him being like, I don't run from things. What's that about? That's part of the mystery of it. And it sets up his character in antithesis based on just even this small bits that we've seen with him in, the Church on Ruby Road and Space Baby so far, like his excitement of learning the language of rope in the Church of Ruby Road, his like wonderment at that. So when he runs away here, that's a thing that he wouldn't do, and that's what interests him, and allows us to kind of see a little bit more into who he is in a very interesting way. The other thing that I want to say about both Ncuti and Ruby is their acting is phenomenal. They both just like have this bubbling energy, like so many like times Ncuti just like spins and jumps that in ways that aren't in the script, but just like speak to this like roiling raucous energy that he has constantly built up that I really love. And his facial expressions are just so full of joy, like when he's like trying to hold, like when Ruby is sort of chastising him at certain moments and he just like kind of is holding back a smile, or his raucous laughter when Ruby like learns that it was boogers, it was like the snot that made the monster, and it was on her, and him just like laughing kind of just jokingly at that was just, I don't know, it brought a sense of real fun and companionship between these two that I'm really loving, in the sense that it feels very like friendly and not romantic. One of the big problems with Russell T Davies in his first 2 years on Doctor Who as a showrunner was a lot of the romantic plots between Rose, and then the unrequited stuff with Martha, which I love Martha, one of my favorite companions actually. But the unrequited romance stuff was very, very frustrating. And he finally nailed it with Donna and David Tennant. And part of the reason we loved them so much was that it was a very just friendly relationship. There wasn't romance between the two of them. And I think despite the fact that we have two very young and attractive looking actors here, they aren't really falling into that romantic angle. And I do really appreciate that, because it allows us to, see, two young attractive people being friends and not having to have romantic tension. And I really hope that they stay the course with that going forward. Also, just to briefly mention, I did like some of the offhanded political messages that this episode had. I mean, first off, you have a clear allusion to the right-wing narrative around abortion, which is like, oh, we're going to force these babies to be born, but then not deal with them or care for them in any way, shape, or form, just sort of leave them to die afterwards and not provide any services for them, and people protesting that. I thought that was, not the direct focus of the episode, but an interesting thing to sort of bring up. You could argue that if they were going to bring it up, they should dive more into it, but I kind of liked it being a sort of peripheral thing that touches upon these larger issues, and also kind of combines it too with these mentioning of the babies being refugees and them not being able to reach a planet that was accepting refugees, and that place not going to come and pick up refugees. Refugees are always forced to go to where they are trying to escape to. So that was sort of, a little interesting little commentary there that could have been kernels for much larger discussions or stories, but was an interesting thing to touch upon here. It also kind of ties into the next episode as well, though in a less overt way, just with the fact that you have Maestro talking about pronouns within the first few minutes of the episode, which I'm sure is going to upset the outraged merchants about, oh, you're bringing pronouns in my Doctor Who again, but I actually think that this integration of pronouns discussion was handled way, way better than it was way back in the Star Beast, where it was a bit more on the nose, and a bit more I'm trying to get in with the youths when discussing the Star Beast's pronouns and all of that. So I did think that this was integrated much better here with Maestro, and was played for fun, and had Maestro kind of play it up in a fun way. So I did enjoy that. Those are just little extra elements that I forgot to mention when I was actually filming this. So you're just getting my sexy, sexy voice. Few things story-wise that I think are worth bringing up with Space Babies. We do have the trip back in time to the dinosaurs and the butterfly effect thing, which was a fun joke. And my friend Vera Wild, who runs the Council of Geeks channel, if you watch her channel, she has a big problem with the butterfly effect addition to Doctor Who. It adds, and I agree, it adds a whole complication of a can of worms that, as a Doctor Who's a time travel show should not be dealing with, and just yada yada. Because it adds too much, and so to have this as a one-off joke here feels like it opens up just a big can of worms for Doctor Who that I don't think it needed to open. That being said, that scene in conjunction with episode 2, where we get much more of the magical realism stuff and the Doctor feeling a little bit more of his element and not know what's going on, makes me wonder if that butterfly effect element was kind of there to be a way to say the Doctor is kind of a little unsure of how the universe works at the moment because of all the stuff that happened with the Toymaker, the Giggle, and all of that jazz, Wild Blue Yonder, with the spreading salt at the edge of the universe stuff. So I'm curious if that kind of plays into the reasoning for adding that. It's not very clear, and the line isn't direct. So perhaps other people have a bigger deal with it. I know Vera probably will. But for me, it was an intriguing enough connection that I'm curious to see how that's going to play out. Some people also may be bothered by the fact that the Doctor breathes the butterfly to life. I'm fine with that, too, because I was like, maybe he didn't breathe it to life, just sort of like healing it a little bit, kind of fix the timeline. And maybe he gave some, Time Lord energy. Who the hell knows? Whatever. There's a bunch of things that it could be. So that all really I thought was kind of fun for me. I'm trying to think of other elements of this. We had the nanny; she was really great. But the element that I think really spoke to me was seeing the Doctor fight to save the bogey monster. And there's this empathy for this monster and wanting to save it, especially through the Doctor's connection as a last of the Time Lords right now. And I think that is, again, a good way to recharacterize this Doctor and to reestablish who the Doctor is for people who are jumping into the show. This is someone who will save monsters if he can and is not callous towards them. I think that feels very much like a good way to characterize Ncuti and also the Doctor generally. So really did appreciate that as an element. It does kind of bring it back to the whole, I'm the last of the Time Lords element, which is a beat that Russell T Davies has used before. And I think the orphan element is perhaps the more interesting angle, considering it's somewhat new for the Doctor, rather than the last of the Time Lords bit, just because we've seen it. Though, to be fair, there's a difference in the last of the Time Lords, because he with Christopher Eccleston and David Tennant's Doctor, and even Matt Smith's to a degree, there was guilt placed within that last of the Time Lords element that isn't here with Ncuti, but it is still a slightly repetitious beat, so I hope we lean more on the orphan element, just because I think that's a new angle for the Doctor. Speaking on that, and this will tie us into episode 2, we do get more of the mystery box with Ruby here, such as when, number one, the snow falling, when the Doctor remembers him visiting Ruby Road, and also the element of his memory changing. So he sees Ruby's mother pointing at him. And so those are interesting mystery box elements. Again, my friend Vera, she hates the mystery box elements of Doctor Who. I will say, I actually do not hate the mystery box elements. I find them to be kind of fun. When I go back and watch older seasons of Doctor Who, I do enjoy seeing little sprinklings of the bees are missing, or there's planets are missing elements, or the Prime Minister, sort of in the background of season 3, series 3, I should say. And Bad Wolf, I like those little sprinklings of Easter eggs throughout a season. And the reason I think those work, and what I'm hesitant for having seen episode 2, is the fact that those are little sprinklings. We stay focused on the main story, and those little seedings of a larger narrative are sort of sprinkled in the background, as opposed to something like, say Star Trek Discovery, which I'm watching right now, which is telling a serialized narrative across a season that has maybe mystery box elements within it, but it's very much every episode is dealing with the mystery box. What I liked about Doctor Who is that we do have a mystery box, but it's not the focus. It's not the thing that we're focusing on. We get to have our own fully complete stories with maybe little sprinklings sprinklings and dashings of the story overall. And I think that works here, because we get a little piece of the puzzle with Ruby in this story, but it's not the main focus. But I worry that it might become a little bit repetitious of Clara when she was first introduced with Matt Smith, where she was just a big mystery box and her whole characterization was a mystery box, and she was less a character. Ruby doesn't seem to be falling fully into that, because we do have some nice ties to her family back home, her mom, and things like that I do like, that don't fall into her mystery box characterization, but it's a little bit of a worry going into episode 2. However, the episode does end with Ruby saying, "We are going to see my mom on Christmas," and ending with her adoptive mom, which I thought was a very sweet moment and a lovely moment that, again, reaffirmed who Ruby is to a degree. I did really find that very touching. So that was all wonderful. But let us go to episode 2, which I think was the one I have more criticisms of, but also the one that I have a lot more fun with, because Jinx as Maestro, holy crap, I loved them to pieces. Just every piece of them in this episode was wonderful. Just the playfulness that quickly turned to menace, and the pulling between a higher pitched and a deeper pitched voice, I thought was just so much fun. They just owned the screen in such a theatrical, over-the-top way that really matched the fact that they are supposed to be this being beyond time and child of the toy maker and this embodiment of music. They were just so fascinating. And so when they came on screen in that one sequence where the doctor runs away and the doctor turns off sound, and so Maestro kind of loses power for a minute, and you just see them just sort of clapping their hands oh, I see what you're doing again, and just being this very theatrical being, felt very menacing and yet fun. And when they put the tuning fork in the water as a way to sort of get sound back, was just such an interesting idea, because it makes intuitive sense. Logically, it makes no sense necessarily, but on an intuitive level, it did. Just vibrations bringing the sound back, and the magical realism elements to this, where there's a magic to it, and yet you can kind of buy and understand the rules and logic without it necessarily being overtly explained to you in that kind of way. I think it's just an interesting way to write Doctor Who, which is, again, always kind of had a magical realism edge to it, but much more grounded in science fiction, whereas this is pushing it into magical realism. And I don't think going full into magic, with maybe a Lord of the Rings style loose magic system, where magic just happens, you don't really need to explain it, Gandalf can come back, it's just sort of very wibbly wobbly, works very well for me, but also still not explaining the rules one for one and having it kind of be this more vibe based magic, I think works in a lot of fun ways, and again matches up with the toy maker with these rules of play. What I also really liked, too, was Shooty being terrified of Maestro and being I don't know how to fight this. This is something new that is beyond me, I think was fascinating. One thing I think weakened it a little bit was the fact that this came right after the Bogeyman episode, the Space Babies, where we also had him running away and him being kind of curious about that, whereas here he's actually much more terrified. And I think having those two story beats back to back within the same release night, I think weakens that beat a little bit with this second episode. Perhaps if they had had an episode between it, or released them week to week, that would have landed a little bit harder. That being said, it's still strong, but having watched these two episodes back to back, it doesn't hit as hard as I think they necessarily wanted it to. But it's still an interesting fact, and just was, I don't know, just set up this cool basis for the story going forward, because it seems like these children of the toy maker, or these these incarnations of concepts, are going to be the main driving force of the episode going forward. I also found it just a lot of fun going and visiting the Beatles. The actors they got to have the Beatles, badly cast, I think, in terms of look. They nailed them in terms of characterization, but just the look of them is kind of weird to me, though that's kind of a Doctor Who staple, right? Just weird casting of famous figures, which I think is fine. They're not beholden to just the actual history. I mean, it's meant to be an educational program to a degree, but very loosey-goosey. So I didn't mind that as much, but this idea that music had been stolen, and when they go into the Abbey Road recording studio and just their faces falling when it's just terrible music, was the funniest thing. I thought I had a lot of joy watching that whole sequence. I don't I thought that they nailed that, the fun of that in a really cool way. But this does bring me to some criticisms, then I'll loop back into some positives here. One major criticism that I have is we do get a lot more of the overall mystery with Ruby here, where like the maestro grabs Ruby and says like, how are you, there's a hidden song within you. How does like this music that is on the night of your birth, so powerful, he is coming, like all these allusions to like a grander being that's coming, and Ruby having some mystery box part in that or connection to that. It just sort of like felt like the story was doing a lot of effort to set that up, and kind of distracting from the main threat of Maestro, especially in how, that element of it sort of just kind of overrides and sort of it is like a final note with Maestro, where the Maestro says, like he's coming at the end when they're defeated. It's just a lot of this like setup for the finale of this season or whatever, the mystery box of Ruby, that I feel like distracts from the power of this story specifically, and felt like it didn't make this story land. The other element of this story that I didn't really particularly love is how it wrapped up, because one of the things that I was enjoying was the fact that, Maestro sort of set up this thing where it's like, how can you beat me when you're not a genius? You're not a musical master, some famous artist throughout time who came up with a chord to create me or introduce to me to this world in the first place. Was you're not on their level. And the Doctor kind of coming in and saying, well, like I sometimes genius is just a lot of hard work, which I do think is the case. Like we have this like sort of mystical idea of art, but I feel like art is, yes, there's an element of like, uniqueness to the person. But I do think a lot of art is, a lot of hard work of learning and growing as an artist and creator, tying in your emotions as who you are as a person and the experiences that you've had in life to sort of inform that art and that skill that you are building. But I do think art is not this mystical process, but a process of learning and growing as a person and your skills. And so I did really like that. And I love the Doctor sort of saying, I can know the technicalities of this. It's hard work, but also tying it into his emotional experiences as the Doctor throughout time to be able to find the chord to beat Maestro. I thought that was a really powerful idea that I really adored. But then it kind of swerves where the Doctor messes up, doesn't get the last note, which I was fine with. Maybe that ties into some element of his character. Maybe there's something he hasn't experienced that doesn't give him a full understanding of the universe to beat Maestro. And I would have liked that to be made explicit, like maybe there's just a piece of experience that he hasn't had yet that he needs to understand. And maybe there's allusions to that later on, like, he doesn't know who his parents are, like Ruby doesn't know who his parents are, so he needs to know that to understand. Like, maybe that's something that they'll go for later on. But it then comes back to, John and Paul coming in and saving the day. And it very much felt like a Beatles ex machina, where they just come out of nowhere. We're told that, Ruby is the only human left with songs, music, and a heart. And then Paul and John come in and, save the day by finding the final chord. And I get on some level, there is a tie into history with, John and Paul working together to find this chord and, the tensions between John and Paul later on in the Beatles' history. And so there's like a connection to like, we're resolving that in their history. But that's not brought up within this episode. And so while people who may know the history of the Beatles may be like, that's really cute and fun and interesting and ties into that, within the story that this episode's telling, it doesn't really. And as a result, it kind of just feels like, these are the musical geniuses who can figure things out. And it kind of ties into this great men of history that I feel like the episode was kind of pulling away from for a large part of it, and then bringing it back to that at the end. And again, I don't think maybe that wasn't the intention, if you know the Beatles' history. But again, it's very reliant on you knowing the Beatles' history. And I wish we had part of the story introduce John and Paul really being at odds and being against each other or something like that tension that was there. Thank God they didn't go with the Yoko Ono, like she caused the tension bullshit. That would have been even worse as a problem. So thank God at least they didn't do that. But yeah, it just felt very, I don't know, the ending with that felt very weird. And then, I was sitting watching with my partner, and one of the things that we were saying to each other was like, this is a really fun episode. I'm really enjoying the music element of it. Like the thematics of it are a lot of fun. Maestro is fantastic. There's a lot of joy there. But but there was no like song. And I'm like, why is there no song? Especially since we got a song in the church on Ruby Rose. There was like a musical element of that episode. Why is this episode about music not getting that? But we do get it at the end after Maestro is defeated. And there's like this whole bit about there's always a twist at the end, which again is alluding to the mystery box element of Doctor Who, which, for some people I like but didn't like in this episode specifically. So it just felt like, this is it's a fun song and I love the visuals, but it feels very tacked on. And it was like, why not do something like this within the context of the episode, like when they were doing the music battle, which was also fun, very Doctor Strange, music battle element. I adored that, and the very Devil Went Down to Georgia sort of feel to it. But it felt like you just tacked on the song, and I was like, oh, okay, thought we were done. This is just, I guess we're doing this now. It just felt needless, and again, fun, and I enjoyed it for what it was on its own terms, but within the context of the episode, it just feels strange as a placement, especially when you could have tied it more. There were very clear ways you could have tied something like that more directly into the narrative. So that felt a little bit weird to me. So that brings me to the end of this episode. I'm kind of trying to think if there's anything major that I missed. I'm sure there's little pieces here and there, but considering a couple beers in, watched 2 episodes both at once, I that's sort of my overriding thoughts, and I'll probably talk more about anything I missed when I review next episode, where I'll have only 1 episode to talk about, so I can sort of sprinkle in some stuff that I missed. But overall, what I will say is I did really, really adore both of these episodes. I think they were a lot of fun and had me both excited as a fan of Doctor Who for a very long time, but also someone who was excited to see where Doctor Who can go next. And I think this episode established, yes, Russell T Davies still understands what makes Doctor Who, and yet is willing to try and do new things with Doctor Who. And while there are elements of some storytelling things from Russell T Davies' era that I don't like, in terms of tying the big mystery too much into the main story that's being told per episode, overall, his style and sense of fun and camp and whimsy, and yet still emotionally resonant and willing to try and do new things, as well as the phenomenal performances of Ncuti Gatwa and Ruby and their characterization together, and also as their own individuals, I thought these were a lot of fun. So on the whole, I think these are a big, strong reintroduction for Doctor Who in this era, and have me very excited to see what the rest of this probably too short a season is going to be. I mean, we're only getting, I think, 8 episodes this season, which is just frustrating and wild to me. Season's just getting shorter and shorter and shorter, which is upsetting for many, many different reasons, not the least of which is someone who's trying to break into the industry is frustrating. But that's a whole other conversation. So what did you think of these 2 episodes of Doctor Who? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. But beyond all of that, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper. I'm going to go have another beer.